Her grandmother lived in that house for 19 years. She was 81 years old when they handed her 47 violation notices, stacked a $9,000 lien on her front door, and told her to sign the papers. She signed. She left. She never came back. What they didn't know, what Vivian Hartwell didn't know, was that the rule she'd used to destroy May Calloway's life. It was never legal. Not one single day of its 11-year existence. And the woman moving into 14 Cedarwood Lane with a canvas jacket and a very quiet voice? She's been building the case for 6 months before she ever knocked on that door. Clause 47, the story of what happens when the wrong woman reads the fine print. Clause 47. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the sugar maples along Cedarwood Lane had turned the color of old copper pennies and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming cold. The driver, a heavy-set man named Hector who had helped Rebecca Calloway move 3 times in the past decade and who had long since stopped asking why, backed carefully into the driveway of 14 Cedarwood Lane, cut the engine, and leaned his forearm out the window. "You sure about this one, Beck?" he asked, surveying the street with the mild suspicion of a man who had seen a lot of neighborhoods and knew that the ones that looked too perfect usually had something going on underneath. Rebecca stood on the sidewalk with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket and didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the street. Every lawn was trimmed to exactly the same height. Every mailbox was painted the same shade of colonial gray. The flower beds at each property line were planted with the same rotation of late-season mums, rust and gold and white, as if a single gardener had worked his way down the block with a template. Even the pumpkins on the front stoops seemed to have been selected for size consistency. "I grew up 2 miles from here," she said. "My grandmother lived in this house for 19 years. Hector looked at the house. It was a 1978 colonial, cream siding, black shutters, a covered front porch with 2 columns. Nothing exceptional. The kind of house that had been built in the tens of thousands across suburban America in the late 70s, sensible and solid and entirely ordinary. Except that the shutters were a slightly different black than she remembered, and the siding had been repainted at some point from the original off-white to a pale gray blue that matched every other house on the block within 3 shades. "Okay then," Hector said. "Let's get your stuff inside before it rains." Rebecca didn't move yet. She was looking at the porch. The columns were the same columns. She knew this because her grandmother, May Calloway, had painted those columns herself every other spring until her hands got too stiff to manage the brush, and she had always used the same Sherwin-Williams white, not the approved gray-blue, just white, because she said white columns on a porch looked like a house that was paying attention. They had been repainted since, obviously, to match whatever color code Cedarwood Estates required these days. But the columns themselves were the same wood, the same dimensions, and most importantly the same right column, which was the one May had crouched beside in the spring of 1987, the year Rebecca was born, and carved a small letter C into the base, low down near the foundation, where it would be hidden by the porch step. Rebecca walked to the porch and crouched down and found it without any trouble. The C was still there, slightly darkened with age and paint residue, but unmistakably cut by hand into the grain of the wood. She put 2 fingers against it and held them there for a moment, feeling the shallow groove. She was still crouching when the sound of an engine made her look up. The white Range Rover moved along Cedarwood Lane with the unhurried certainty of a vehicle that has never had to yield to anyone, pulled to the curb in front of number 14, and stopped. The woman who stepped out was perhaps 55 years old, with champagne blonde hair that had been professionally blown out into a smooth wave and was holding its shape in the autumn wind through what must have been significant product investment. She wore a camel-colored blazer over a cream silk blouse, pressed trousers in a matching cream, and low-heeled ankle boots that were too nice to be outside on a moving day. She carried a clipboard in the crook of one arm and a tasteful gift bag in the other, and she moved across the sidewalk with the controlled, forward-leaning momentum of someone who had long since stopped checking whether the space ahead of her was clear, because it always was. Her smile arrived first, a practiced and perfectly calibrated expression that communicated warmth, authority, and the subtle suggestion that she was doing you a favor by directing it at you. "Good morning," she said, extending her hand as Rebecca straightened from the porch step. "You must be the new owner of number 14. I'm Vivian Hartwell, president of the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her handshake was firm in the way of someone who had read that firm handshakes projected confidence. "Rebecca Calloway," Rebecca said. "Good to meet you." "Calloway." Vivian's head tilted a fraction, a microsecond of recalibration, quickly smoothed over. "Are you by any chance related to the woman who previously owned this property? May Calloway?" "She was my grandmother." "What a lovely coincidence." The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did, a brief flash of reassessment, the look of a chess player realizing a piece has moved in an unexpected direction. Well, we're absolutely delighted to have you. Cedarwood Estates is a truly wonderful community. I think you'll find it's a very special place to live. She extended the gift bag. I put together a little welcome package for you. Inside you'll find our CC&Rs, our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, along with the current community guidelines, fee schedule, and a calendar of upcoming events. We've always found it works best for everyone when new residents have the chance to familiarize themselves with our standards right away. It saves so much confusion later. Rebecca took the bag. It was heavy. She glanced inside and saw a spiral-bound document that was at least 80 pages thick. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." "Of course." Vivian clicked her pen against the clipboard with a crisp, decisive sound. "Now, I do need to make you aware of one small matter, completely as a formality. Your moving truck has been parked partially on the sidewalk apron for," she checked her watch with a quick, practiced motion, "approximately 23 minutes, which puts it in technical conflict with Section 12, Paragraph B of our Street Use Guidelines. Standard fine is $150. I'll have the notice sent to your address of record, but I always waive first violations for new residents as a welcome courtesy. Consider it a heads up for the future." Rebecca looked at the truck, which was, by her estimate, approximately 14 inches onto the sidewalk apron at its widest point. She looked at Vivian. She kept her voice pleasant and entirely neutral. "I appreciate the heads up. Could I ask, which meeting produced Section 12, Paragraph B? I'd like to pull the minutes and read the context, just to understand the intent behind it." Vivian blinked. It was the blink of someone who had just heard a question they had genuinely never been asked before. "I beg your pardon?" "The meeting minutes. The resolution number when that particular section was adopted." Rebecca kept smiling. "I find it always helps to read a rule alongside the discussion that produced it. It makes the intent clearer. It's just a habit I have." The smile on Vivian's face underwent a subtle structural change, still present, still technically warm, but now operating from a different set of muscles. "I'll have our secretary send that information over." She made a small notation on her clipboard. "Welcome to Cedarwood, Ms. Calloway. I look forward to getting to know you better." She walked back to the Range Rover with the same forward momentum, reversed out of the approach without signaling, and moved down the street. Rebecca watched the vehicle until it turned the corner. Hector appeared at her shoulder. "Friend of yours?" "Not yet," Rebecca said. She carried the gift bag inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and removed the CC&Rs. They were 89 pages, spiral-bound, printed on heavy cream stock, with color-coded post-it tabs marking the sections that involved fines. Someone had put considerable effort into this welcome package. She made a cup of coffee from the single-cup maker she'd packed in the front of the truck specifically for this purpose, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to read. She read for 4 hours while Hector and his assistant moved her furniture in around her, and she made notes on a legal pad she'd also packed in the front of the truck, and by the time the truck was empty and Hector had accepted a cup of coffee and driven away into the gray October afternoon, she had filled 11 pages of notes and had a very clear preliminary picture of what she was dealing with. She also had the beginning of what she suspected would become, over the following months, one of the most satisfying cases of her professional life. She had learned, in 16 years of practice, to recognize that particular feeling early. It felt like finding a structural crack in a wall that everyone else had been painting over. Rebecca Calloway was a land use and fair housing attorney. She was 44 years old, and she had spent those years becoming exceptionally good at a corner of the law that most people didn't know existed and that almost no one chose voluntarily. The intersection of community governance documents and federal fair housing protections was not glamorous work. It didn't generate headlines or large contingency fees. It generated, instead, a steady and deeply unglamorous stream of documents, CC&Rs and bylaws and meeting minutes and financial filings and county recorder records, that she read with the focused attention of someone dismantling a complex machine, looking for the part that shouldn't be there, or the part that should be there and isn't. She had started her career at a mid-sized firm in Richmond doing general real estate work, which she had found technically interesting and spiritually empty. After 4 years she had moved to Washington, D.C., and joined the Housing Equity Legal Center, a nonprofit that litigated fair housing and property rights cases on behalf of clients who couldn't otherwise afford representation. She had been there for 7 years. In that time she had litigated cases in 12 states, testified before a state legislature on 2 occasions and a congressional subcommittee once, argued 3 cases in federal district court, and settled dozens more before they reached that stage. She had a shelf of professional awards she kept in her office closet because she thought putting them on the wall was the kind of thing you did when you'd stopped moving forward. She was also, though she had never said this out loud to anyone except her grandmother, The kind of person who carried old grievances the way other people carried heirlooms, carefully, with full awareness of their weight, with no intention of putting them down until the time was right. She had decided to buy 14 Cedarwood Lane 2 years ago, when May Calloway's estate finally cleared probate after 3 years of complications that had always seemed, to Rebecca's trained eye, like complications that had been arranged rather than encountered. She had spent the 6 months before closing quietly pulling every public record she could find about Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association from the county recorder's office, the state corporate registry, and the HOA's required annual financial filings. What she had found in those documents had made her sit very still for a long time and then begin, methodically, to prepare. She had not told anyone what she was preparing for. That was a habit, too, one she had developed early. You built the structure first. Then you let people see it. It took her 3 evenings to read the CC&Rs properly, not skimming, not extracting, but reading the way she read everything, which was the way a structural engineer reads blueprints, looking not just for what was there but for what the relationships between things implied, for load-bearing assumptions, for the places where the weight of the whole document rested on a single provision. The original CC&Rs, filed with the county recorder in 1998 when Cedarwood Estates was developed, were 31 pages of standard HOA boilerplate. Maintenance requirements, architectural review procedures, modest enforcement provisions with caps on fines, a straightforward dispute resolution process. Nothing unusual. The kind of document that could be written in a weekend from a template and that most residents would never read from cover to cover. But in 2014, the CC&Rs had been significantly amended. The amendment had added 22 new pages and, in Section 47, had inserted a provision that read: "The association, acting through its board of directors, shall have full authority to manage, regulate, improve, and make beneficial use of any common area, shared space, or undeveloped parcel within or adjacent to the Cedarwood Estates boundaries for the purpose of maintaining community standards and protecting property values, as determined in the sole discretion of the board." Rebecca read this 3 times. Then she set down her pen and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This was the kind of provision that a first-year law student would recognize immediately as dangerously overbroad: any common area, shared space, or undeveloped parcel, sole discretion of the board, with no defined limits, no accountability mechanism, no requirement for resident approval of specific actions taken under its authority. In plain language it said, the board can do anything it wants to any land in or near this community, as long as it calls it community improvement, and nobody can challenge that judgment. Every significant action the HOA had taken since 2014, every major fine, every lien, every contract authorization, every encroachment, had been taken under the umbrella of Section 47. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. She flipped to the back of the document, where the amendment's adoption record was included as an exhibit. The 2014 amendment had been approved by a membership vote in June of that year. The record showed 76 votes in favor out of a community of 112 homes. She took out her legal pad and did the arithmetic. Under state law, amendments to HOA governing documents required approval by a supermajority of at least 67% of all eligible owners. Not 67% of those who voted, 67% of all owners. 67% of 112 was 75.04, meaning they needed at minimum 76 valid votes. They had reported exactly 76. She opened her laptop and navigated to the county recorder's database. State law required HOAs to attach to any recorded amendment an affidavit from the board president confirming proper notice and sufficient member approval, along with a supporting voting roster. The affidavit for the 2014 amendment had been signed by Vivian Hartwell and notarized. The voting roster was attached as a 30-page exhibit. She printed the roster. She sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and a red pen and began going through the names against the county assessor's ownership records for 2014. Which she had already obtained through a public records request 3 months earlier, specifically for this purpose. She counted once. 73. She put the red pen down, took a breath, picked it up again, and counted a second time, more slowly, checking each name individually against the assessor list. 73. She got up and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark backyard and the neighbor's fence and the oak tree whose roots were already beginning to lift a corner of the flagstone path. She stood there for about 2 minutes. Then she walked back to the table and counted a third time, because in 16 years she had learned never to trust a number this significant until she had verified it 3 times from 3 slightly different angles. The third count confirmed it. 3 of the 76 listed votes were invalid. 1 corresponded to a property whose ownership had transferred to new owners 6 months before the vote, meaning the person who signed was no longer an eligible member. 1 appeared to be a duplicate, The same property address appeared twice on the roster with slightly different name spellings. One corresponded to an address that did not appear in the assessor's records for Cedarwood Estates at all, a street number that, when she cross-referenced it against the subdivision plat, simply didn't exist. 73 valid votes. Out of 112 eligible owners. 65.17%. Below the required 67% threshold by 3.04 votes. Section 47 had never been validly adopted. It had been void from the moment it was filed. Every single action taken under its authority for the past 10 years, every fine assessed, every lien placed, every contract signed without competitive bidding, every encroachment on residential property, had been taken without legal foundation. Rebecca sat at her kitchen table for a long time, with the October wind moving outside and the porch board settling in the cold, and thought about her grandmother. She thought about an 81-year-old woman sitting at this same kitchen table, or one very much like it, reading violation notices she couldn't fully understand, watching the numbers add up in a column that always got longer, trying to figure out what she had done wrong and why it was happening to her. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a clean page, in her neat precise hand, Section 47, void ab initio. Build the record. The woman who knocked on her door the following morning was 70 years old and carried herself with the upright, deliberate posture of someone who had decided at some point in her life that she was not going to be overlooked and had maintained that decision through decades of practice. She had silver hair pinned back from a face that was watchful and composed, and she wore a cardigan the color of old ivy over a collared blouse, and she held a foil-covered plate with both hands. "I made a coffee cake," she said. "I'm Eleanor Marsh. I live at number 9, on the other side of the cul-de-sac. I've lived there for 22 years. She paused. "I knew your grandmother." Rebecca stepped back from the door. "Please come in." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and did not speak immediately. She looked around the kitchen the way people look at a room where they have memories, taking inventory of what's changed. Rebecca cut 2 slices of the coffee cake and set them on plates and waited. "I wanted to talk to you before anyone else did," Eleanor said. "I imagine Vivian already visited." "Yesterday, within an hour of the truck arriving." Eleanor nodded as if this confirmed something. "She visits everyone. She has a system." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, a small, contained gesture. "I need you to understand something about your grandmother, because I think it matters to why you're here. May didn't leave this house because she wanted to. May held on for 3 years. She was one of the most stubborn and clear-minded women I've ever known, and she held on as long as she possibly could." Rebecca said nothing. She kept her face neutral and open. From 2016 to 2019 she received 47 violation notices, Eleanor said. "I kept copies. I was a paralegal for 30 years, I never lost the habit of keeping copies of things." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small manila envelope, which she set on the table between them. "Every notice is in there, with dates and amounts. The fines accumulated to $9,200 by the spring of 2019. The board put a lien on the property under Section 47. She said the name of that section the way you say the name of something you've had reason to think about bitterly for a long time. May's lawyer told her she could fight it, but the legal fees would cost more than the lien, and she was 81 with a bad hip and a heart condition, and she was alone, and," Eleanor stopped. She looked at the window for a moment. "She sold to get clear of it. The buyer was a company called Cedarwood Property Solutions LLC. They sold it 14 months later for 31% more than they paid her." The kitchen was very quiet. She moved into an apartment in Falls Church. A nice enough apartment, her daughter's idea. "But she talked about this house every time I called her, right up until she couldn't anymore. She died in March of 2021. 2 weeks before her 83rd birthday." Eleanor looked at Rebecca directly. "She told me once, near the end, that she wished she'd had someone in her corner who understood the paperwork. She said, 'Eleanor, they beat me with their own rules and I didn't know how to fight back.' That's almost the exact word she used." Rebecca looked down at her coffee cup. Then she looked up. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something directly. The documents in that envelope, would you be willing, if this situation ever moves to a formal legal proceeding, to be a witness? Not to take action yourself. Just to testify to what you observed and kept record of." Eleanor looked at her with the focused, steady regard of someone who has been waiting to be asked a specific question and is measuring whether the person asking it is worthy of the answer. "I have been waiting," she said quietly, "for 3 years for someone to ask me that." "Yes. Absolutely yes." The envelope contained more than Rebecca had expected. Eleanor had kept not only copies of May's violation notices but a detailed handwritten log she had maintained over the 3 years of the enforcement campaign, dates, fine amounts, descriptions of the alleged infractions, the names of board members present at relevant meetings. She had done this, she explained, because something about the pattern had troubled her from early on. The notices arrived with a frequency and at a level of specificity that didn't seem like routine enforcement. They seemed like a project. She had also kept 2 other items. One was a photocopy of a check. She had found it tucked into a stack of papers May had asked her to help sort through in late 2018, when the paperwork had become overwhelming. The check was made out from the HOA's operating account to Hartwell Home Services LLC in the amount of $14,400. The memo line read quarterly landscape maintenance. The other item was a printout from the state business registry that Eleanor had pulled herself, the old paralegal habit asserting itself, after she saw the check. Hartwell Home Services LLC had been incorporated in 2013. Its registered agent was listed as Douglas Hartwell, with a business address that matched a residential property on the east side of the county. Rebecca added these to the file she was building in a locked accordion folder on the top shelf of her closet. Over the following 3 weeks, she pulled records with the systematic patience that her law school mentor had called her most important professional quality, more important than her legal reasoning, more important than her courtroom presence, more important than anything else, because cases weren't won by brilliant arguments made in the heat of the moment, they were won by careful people who had prepared everything before they walked into the room. She submitted a public records request to the county recorder for all financial filings submitted by Cedarwood Estates HOA since 2010. State law required any HOA with annual dues above a certain threshold to submit annual financial summaries to the county, and these were public record. She submitted a second request for all recorded liens placed on Cedarwood Estates property since 2010. She submitted a third request for the complete ownership transfer history of every parcel in the subdivision. She submitted a fourth request to the state corporate registry for all entities with Cedarwood or Hartwell in their registered names. While she waited for the records to arrive, she went to her first HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was a rectangular beige carpeted room with fluorescent lighting and the specific smell of institutional buildings everywhere, floor cleaner and old coffee and the faint underlayer of accumulated meetings. Folding chairs had been arranged in theater rows facing a long folding table at the front, where the board members sat. Rebecca arrived 10 minutes early and chose a seat 3 rows back, center, with a clear line of sight to all 5 board members and to the main door. Vivian Hartwell sat at the center of the board table, the clipboard in front of her replaced by a leather portfolio, a glass of water precisely positioned to her right. She wore a deep navy blazer and had the groomed, composed bearing of someone who has run the same meeting so many times that it has become a performance they could deliver in their sleep. To her left sat a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a ruddy face and the watchful, slightly combative expression of a man who expects to be challenged and is prepared for it. This was Douglas Hartwell, listed on the posted agenda as treasurer, and who was, as Rebecca's research had confirmed, Vivian's husband. Next to Douglas sat Philip Crane, a retired insurance adjuster in his mid-60s who deferred to Vivian on every question with the reliability of a man who had decided long ago that agreement was easier than engagement. Beside him was Sandra Fitch, who nodded at approximately 90-second intervals regardless of what was being said, like a metronome set to a low tempo. At the far end of the table, separated from the others by a chair that he had shifted slightly back from the table's edge, sat Marcus Davenport, perhaps 38, dark-haired, with the athletic build of someone who used to play sports and the tired eyes of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. He was the newest board member and, as Rebecca had learned from Eleanor, was Vivian's son-in-law. She studied him for a moment. He sat apart from the other 4 in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable but clear enough to mean something. When Vivian made a joke during her opening remarks, the other 3 laughed. Marcus produced a polite, contained smile that didn't reach his eyes. The meeting ran with the mechanical efficiency of a well-rehearsed script. Agenda items were moved through, motioned, seconded, approved. The financial report was presented as a single-page summary with no line-item detail: annual revenues, total expenditures broken into 4 broad categories, ending fund balance. The contractor for a proposed new entrance beautification project, $67,000, according to the agenda, was identified only as our established vendor, and no competing bids were mentioned. The motion to approve passed 4-1. Marcus voted no without comment or explanation, and Vivian's jaw tightened slightly and then released, and she moved on. When the public comment period opened, Rebecca raised her hand. "Ms. Calloway," Vivian said. Her voice was professionally warm, with the mildest possible emphasis on the name, just enough to signal awareness without creating anything that could be called unwelcome. "Welcome to your first meeting with us." "Thank you." Rebecca stood. She had not brought notes. "I have a question about the financial summary." The line item for property management and maintenance services shows $112,000 for the past fiscal year. Could you tell us which vendors that represents, and whether those contracts went through a competitive bidding process as required under Article 7 of the bylaws? The room changed in the way rooms change when something unexpected happens, not loudly, but perceptibly, a shift in the quality of the attention. Philip Crane looked at his hands. Sandra Fitch stopped nodding. 3 rows behind Rebecca, she heard a small, quiet exhale that sounded like someone releasing breath they'd been holding for a while. Vivian's smile remained exactly in place. Our financial details are summarized for general meetings, but all documentation is fully available to board members for review. For specific financial inquiries, we'd encourage residents to submit requests in writing to the board secretary. That ensures everything is handled properly and nothing gets lost. Of course. Rebecca kept her voice pleasant and unremarkable. I'll submit that in writing. I'd also like to formally request, under the State HOA Transparency Act, copies of all vendor contracts executed in the past 3 fiscal years and the corresponding board minutes authorizing each contract. I'll note that under Section 4.7 of that statute, the board has 30 days to respond. Could you confirm the best method for submitting that request? The pause was very brief, but it was there. You can email the board secretary, Vivian said. Her address is on the website. Wonderful. Thank you. Rebecca sat down. A moment later, a folded piece of paper was passed forward from 2 rows behind her. She opened it under cover of her legal pad. It read, I got a $3,800 fine for painting my garage door 2% off the approved swatch. They brought a spectrophotometer. A spectrophotometer. I've been here 2 years and I've gotten 8 notices. My name is Raj Patel, number 23. Can we talk? She wrote back, after the meeting. I'll be by the parking lot. R.C. Raj Patel was 32, an electrical engineer at a defense contractor in Reston, and he was one of those people whose anger, once you got past the polite surface, was so clean and specific and well-founded that it was almost clarifying to be near. They stood in the clubhouse parking lot in the cold after the meeting, breath clouding, Raj with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets. He was not a man who gestured when he talked, which gave his words an unadorned directness that Rebecca appreciated. 8 notices in 22 months, he said. Every single one for something that required active, deliberate observation to detect. My hose was left on the driveway for 3 hours on a Saturday, I know because I checked my calendar to see if I'd been home that afternoon, and the notice arrived 4 days later citing a specific time window. My mailbox number font was 2 points too large. My wife's car was parked in the street overnight on a Tuesday, which apparently violates Section 14 even though none of our neighbors have ever received that notice. The garage door was the last one. They sent someone with a spectrophotometer. A calibration instrument for color measurement. To measure my garage door. Did you appeal any of them? The first 3. The board reviewed them and upheld all 3. The review process is, there's no independent review, the board reviews the board's own decisions. He paused. I grew up in this country. I was born here. I have a security clearance and a mortgage and a graduate degree, and I feel like I'm living in a place where someone has decided that I need to be watched. He said it flatly, without self-pity. My wife wants to move. I don't want to move, because moving means they win, and I don't want them to win. Rebecca looked at him carefully. I need to ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Do you have any reason to believe the enforcement targeting you has been more intense than enforcement targeting your neighbors with similar properties? He met her eyes. My neighbor at number 21 painted his entire front door a color that is not on the approved list. I checked. He got a courtesy notice. I got a $4,000 fine. He paused. My neighbor at 21 is named Kevin. His family has been in this country for 4 generations and his grandfather played golf with someone who used to be in local government. If that answers your question. It's part of an answer, she said. I'm building a fuller picture. I'd like to ask you to do 2 things. Keep documenting everything, every notice, every interaction, every amount, with dates and times. And when the time comes, I don't know exactly when, but I think not too long from now, I'd like to ask you to sign a formal statement about your experience here. I'll do both, he said, without hesitation. What are you building? She considered how much to say. A complete picture of how this HOA has operated, legally and financially, over the past 10 years. Some of what I've found so far is concerning. I don't want to tell you more than I can support yet. You're a lawyer, aren't you? Eleanor told me to trust you. She said someone was coming who would know how to handle this. I'm a land use and fair housing attorney. I work at a non-profit in D.C. She paused. I bought this house because my grandmother used to live in it, and because she was pushed out of it in a way I believe was illegal, and because I intend to understand fully what happened here." Raj nodded slowly. In the parking lot light his expression had shifted from anger to something more like relief, the specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has just seen the possibility of setting part of it down. "Tell me what you need," he said. The public records arrived over 3 weeks, a cascade of manila envelopes and PDF attachments that Rebecca spread across the dining room table and the living room floor and began working through with the systematic patience that this kind of work required. The dining room table held the financial records. The living room floor held the property transfer records. Her laptop screen showed the corporate registry search results, updated in real time as new filings came in. She worked through evenings and weekends, cross-referencing, building the picture she had known, from those first 6 months of preliminary research, was there to be built. What the financial records told her, from 2014 to the present, the HOA's annual expenditures in the property management and maintenance category had increased from $31,000 per year to $112,000 per year. The increase had happened in 3 steps, a jump in 2014, another in 2017, a final escalation in 2020, and each step corresponded exactly with a period when she could identify, from the corporate registry, an expansion or restructuring of Hartwell Home Services LLC. She couldn't yet confirm from the HOA's public filings that Hartwell Home Services was the vendor. Those filings didn't name vendors, but the timing correlation was exact. What the lien records told her, since 2014, 11 liens had been placed on Cedarwood Estates properties under the authority of Section 47. 7 of those properties had transferred ownership within 18 months of the lien placement. All 7 had sold at prices between 18 and 28% below the assessed market value at the time. 6 of the 7 had transferred to one of 3 entities, Cedarwood Property Solutions LLC, Hartwell Residential Holdings Incorporated, or a trust recorded as the Cedar Group Trust. All 3 entities shared a registered agent, a small law firm in a suburb of the city. Rebecca noted the firm's name and pulled its public filings. What the ownership transfer history told her, she built a map. Every parcel in the subdivision, every transfer since 2010, marked with the demographics of the selling household where she could determine it from public records. Of the 11 households that had been displaced by lien-related sales, 9 had been headed by Black or Latino homeowners, or by white homeowners over the age of 70 with no adult family members living nearby. The 2 exceptions were households that had been transferred as part of estate proceedings rather than financial pressure. May Calloway had received more individual violation notices in a 3-year period than any other resident in the HOA's recorded history. Rebecca sat with that fact for a while. She also pulled the demographic data for the community as a whole. In 2010, according to county voter registration and assessor records, approximately 31% of Cedarwood Estates households had been headed by non-white owners. In the current year, that figure was approximately 12%. The change had happened almost entirely through the displacement mechanism she was documenting. She made a note in her file, Fair Housing Act, 42 U.S. C. Section 3604, Discriminatory Terms and Conditions, Section 3617, Interference with Rights. Pattern evidence sufficient for preliminary showing. Recommend federal agency referral concurrent with state action. She also, on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, met Lorraine Vega at the community mailbox cluster, which she had begun to think of as the place where things happened in Cedarwood Estates, and which was situated at the intersection of 2 sight lines that made it impossible to approach without being visible from at least 6 homes including Vivian's. Lorraine was 46, with short dark hair and preoccupied dark eyes, and she was sorting her mail with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was partially elsewhere. Rebecca had found her name in the HOA's public filing as the outside bookkeeper retained to prepare the annual county submissions, and had been thinking about how to approach the conversation. She introduced herself simply as a new resident. They talked briefly about the neighborhood, the season, the recent meeting. Then Rebecca said, apparently casually, "I was looking at the annual financial filings, the ones required by state law. I'm not an accountant, I'm an attorney, so I may be reading them wrong, but some of the expenditure figures seem like they might not reconcile with each other internally. The vendor cost categories in particular." Lorraine stopped sorting her mail. She didn't look up immediately. "I prepare those filings based on documentation provided to me by the board. I compile what I'm given. Of course. If the underlying transactions don't match the documentation I receive, I wouldn't necessarily see that. I'm working from what's handed to me. That makes complete sense. It's a limitation of any outside bookkeeping arrangement." Lorraine was quiet for a moment. A car passed. The blue jay that seemed to live permanently in the cedar trees near the mailboxes landed briefly on the cluster and departed. "I've wondered," Lorraine said, in a tone that was calibrated very carefully to be neither a statement nor quite a question, "whether the source documents I receive represent the complete picture. A reasonable thing to wonder. If residents were to request an independent audit, which I believe they have the right to do under state law, with sufficient signatures." 20% of owners, Rebecca said. 22 signatures. Lorraine finally looked at her directly. It was the look of someone measuring, quickly and carefully, whether the person across from them can be trusted. Rebecca had been evaluated that way many times, and she knew the only correct response was to hold the gaze steadily and let the measurement happen. "It was nice to meet you, Ms. Calloway," Lorraine said, putting the remainder of her mail under her arm. "If you ever have questions about how financial documentation works in an HOA context, the kind of questions that might come up in an audit process, I think a bookkeeper with inside knowledge could be helpful to have in your corner." "I think so too," Rebecca said. "Thank you, Lorraine." She walked back to her house in the thin November light, and added Lorraine's name to the mental list of people she would need when the time came. The first wave of retaliation arrived on a Thursday, slipped through her mail slot while she was at her desk working, so she didn't see who delivered it. 3 violation notices, hand-delivered on the same day, each in a separate envelope with the HOA's letterhead. She read them at the kitchen table with her coffee. The first cited a potted fern on her front porch that measured, per the notice, 21.3 inches in height, exceeding the 18-inch limit established under Section 8, Paragraph C. The second cited a section of downspout bracket visible from the street that had been installed in a silver finish metal rather than the required black or oil-rubbed bronze finish specified in the architectural standards. The third cited her for conducting commercial activities in a residential zone on the basis that a FedEx commercial delivery vehicle had been observed making deliveries to her address on 3 separate occasions within a 2-week period. Total assessed fines, $2,200. She read each notice twice, with the unhurried attention she gave to all documents. Then she put them in a neat stack and went to her laptop and opened a new document and began to draft her responses. She wrote 3 separate letters, one per notice, each precisely 2 pages in length. Each letter cited the specific CC&Rs section the notice purported to enforce, identified the adoption date and resolution number of that section, and raised the specific legal deficiency in the violation's characterization. The potted fern letter noted that Section 8, Paragraph C had been adopted in the 2014 amendment and raised, without fully developing, the question of that amendment's procedural validity. The downspout bracket letter noted that the architectural standards document containing the finish requirement had never been formally incorporated by reference into the CC&Rs and therefore had no binding enforcement authority on its own. The commercial activity letter was the most pleasant to write, because there was excellent case law on this specific question, 3 Federal Circuit cases and 1 state appellate decision directly on point, all holding that residential package delivery by commercial carriers to a homeowner receiving personal shipments cannot constitute commercial activity by the homeowner under standard residential zoning or HOA restrictions. She cited all 4 cases, quoted the relevant holdings, and noted that the legal position was so well settled that raising the violation could expose the board to a fee-shifting claim if she chose to pursue it. She signed each letter, made 3 copies of each, and sent them certified mail with return receipt requested to Vivian Hartwell as board president, to the board secretary, and to the HOA's attorney of record. She also hand-delivered a copy to each board member's residence, leaving them in the mailboxes with a brief cover note identifying herself and inviting any questions. This was not, she knew, what Vivian had expected. The standard response to an HOA violation notice was either to pay the fine, to send an informal email objecting, or to ignore it and hope the problem went away. What you did not do, what almost no one knew to do, was respond with a precisely documented legal memorandum citing case law on each point. The asymmetry of information was the whole mechanism, it only worked if the target didn't know the rules. The response from the HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, arrived by certified mail 8 days later. It informed her that the board had reviewed her responses and found them legally unpersuasive and that the fines stood and were now accruing interest, and that if she continued to harass board members with unsolicited legal correspondence, the board reserved the right to seek injunctive relief for interference with HOA operations. She read the letter twice and noted several things about it. The reasoning was asserted but not supported. It contained no case law and no statutory citations. It used the word harass to describe formal written requests submitted through proper channels, which was legally incorrect and potentially defamatory, and it had been drafted in a style that suggested its author had not appeared in a courtroom with any regularity in the recent past. Gerald Fitch was, she noted from his state bar profile, A general real estate transactional attorney who had been practicing for 27 years and whose practice overview mentioned no litigation work. She wrote back briefly, noting that her correspondence had been sent to board members in their official capacities as officers of a nonprofit corporation subject to state HOA law, that such correspondence was explicitly protected under the State HOA Transparency Act, that the characterization of her communications as harassment was legally unsupported, and that she was copying this response to the State Attorney General's HOA Oversight Division, the County Consumer Protection Office, and the State Bar's Professional Conduct Office, as she would all future correspondence, simply as a matter of record keeping. She did not send this letter to threaten. She sent it because a documented paper trail, built early and consistently, was the most durable form of evidence there was. Every letter, every response, every refusal, all of it was material. You built the record the way you built anything, one piece at a time, carefully, before you needed it. Marcus Davenport knocked on her door on the second Tuesday of November, at 7:15 in the evening, in the rain. He wore a dark jacket and had the expression of a man who has made a decision that he hasn't entirely made peace with yet. She let him in. He stood in her entryway, dripping slightly, and declined the offer of coffee, and then accepted it. They sat at the kitchen table and she waited while he worked up to it. "I want to understand something," he said finally. "What you're doing, where does it end? What's the outcome you're working toward?" "That depends on what the evidence shows. I'm building a complete picture of how this HOA has operated legally and financially for the past decade. I don't know yet exactly what the picture will show, though I have preliminary findings. When the picture is complete, the outcome will depend on what the relevant institutions decide to do with it." "You're saying you're going to hand it to someone?" "When the time is right, yes." He nodded slowly. "I need to tell you some things. I'm not sure how to. I want to tell you that I'm not part of what's been happening here in the way that, I need you to understand that I've been kept away from the financial side deliberately. Vivian controls the accounts, her and Douglas. My name is on the board, I attend the meetings, I cast votes. I haven't seen a full set of bank statements since I joined." "Have you asked for them?" A pause. "I asked once. About a year ago. Vivian told me it wasn't necessary for board members to review individual accounts, that the board's fiduciary responsibility was satisfied by reviewing the annual summaries. I accepted that because," he stopped. "Because I'm married to her daughter and because it was easier to accept than to pursue it. I know that's not a defense." "It's a description," Rebecca said neutrally. "What changed?" "Your letter about the financial records. The one you sent to the board last week." He looked at her directly. "I read it and I knew what it meant and I knew what it was going to find, and I realized I'd been sitting at that table for 2 years knowing something was wrong and choosing not to look at it. And that has a name, legally. Constructive knowledge," she said. "Potentially willful blindness. Depending on what the investigation finds, it could create exposure for you or it might not. I can't tell you which." He absorbed this. "What do I need to do?" "Put your request for a complete financial review in writing, formally, as a board member. Include all accounts, all vendor contracts, all bank statements for the past 3 years. Date it and submit it through the board's official process. When Vivian refuses, and I believe she will refuse, that refusal is documented." "And that protects me?" "It demonstrates that you took action when you became aware of a concern. It also creates a record of the board president blocking a member's access to financial records, which is itself a violation of your state's nonprofit board governance statute." She paused. "Marcus, I'm not your lawyer. I can't give you legal advice. I can tell you what I observe about your situation and what actions are available to you." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife doesn't know most of this. She thinks her mother is difficult, controlling, overbearing. She doesn't know the extent of it." He looked at his hands. "I don't know how to handle that part. That's not my problem to solve for you. I don't mean that harshly. I just mean, there are things I can help with and things I can't, and that's the second kind." She met his eyes. "Write the letter. Date it. Send it through proper channels." He left 20 minutes later. She stood in her doorway and listened to his car start and pull away, and then she went back to the kitchen table and added a new entry to her case file under the heading Board Member, Internal Access Request. She found the most important piece of evidence in the third week of November in a place she almost hadn't looked. When she'd taken possession of the house, the previous owners, a couple who had bought the property from Cedarwood Property Solutions and spent 8 months doing a cosmetic renovation before flipping it, had left a small number of items in the basement storage room that they clearly hadn't considered worth retrieving. Old paint cans. A broken hose reel. 3 cardboard boxes of miscellaneous hardware and outlet covers and the kind of miscellaneous domestic debris that accumulates in basements and moves from house to house without anyone quite deciding to keep it or throw it away. She had been planning to haul the boxes to the curb but hadn't gotten to it yet, and on a rainy November evening with no particular agenda she went down to the basement and began going through them, because that was the kind of thing she did when she was thinking. Most of it was trash. 2.5 boxes in, pushed to the back corner behind a broken shelf bracket and slightly water damaged along the bottom, she found a box labeled in faded marker, May, Papers, 2019. She stood very still for a moment. Then she carried the box upstairs to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were things her grandmother had apparently been keeping and hadn't taken when she left, or hadn't been able to take, or hadn't thought to take. Old tax records going back to the 1990s. A binder of home maintenance records, HVAC service dates, roof inspections, appliance warranties. A small photo album. A folder of utility bills arranged by year. And at the bottom of the box, in a plain manila envelope that had been sealed and reopened and sealed again with a strip of clear tape, a sheaf of papers. Rebecca removed them carefully and spread them on the table. They were communications from Gerald Fitch, the HOA's attorney. They covered the period from 2017 through 2019, documenting in formal legal language the process by which the HOA had accumulated and enforced the fines against May Calloway and ultimately placed the lien on the property. They were the kind of documents that a lawyer would recognize as the procedural record of a systematic enforcement campaign. But the critical document was a single letter, clipped to the others with a paperclip that had left a rust ring on the top page. It was addressed to Vivian Hartwell, dated September 14, 2018, and marked at the top, Attorney-Client Communication, Privileged and Confidential. It should never have been in May Calloway's possession. Gerald Fitch had accidentally included it in a package of documents sent to May's address, almost certainly a clerical error in his office, a misdirected envelope, the kind of mistake that happened in small practices when the volume of correspondence ran ahead of the attention paid to addressing it. May had received it. She had apparently read it, because several passages were circled in pencil, and in the margin beside one paragraph she had written, in her small careful handwriting, "What does this mean? Am I wrong?" Rebecca read the circled paragraph. Gerald Fitch had written to Vivian, "I want to reiterate the concern I raised in our August meeting. The current enforcement approach, while defensible under Section 47 as currently drafted, carries material risk if the 2014 amendment is ever subjected to procedural challenge. As I mentioned, the vote count issue is not trivial. A court reviewing the adoption record could reasonably find the supermajority requirement was not met, which would void the amendment from inception and expose the board to significant liability for all enforcement actions taken under it. My strong recommendation remains that we take corrective action now, either by conducting a fresh ratification vote or by limiting enforcement to provisions from the original 1998 document. I understand the board's position, but I want this advice on record." Vivian had not followed this advice. Rebecca knew this because 3 months after this letter, Gerald Fitch had filed the lien against May Calloway's property. She also knew something else. When a confidential attorney-client communication was accidentally provided to a third party, the privilege over that specific communication was waived under standard evidence law. The document was now fully admissible. Vivian's own attorney had told her, in writing, in 2018, that the legal foundation of her entire operation was potentially void, and had recommended she fix it, and she had chosen instead to accelerate the enforcement process against an 81-year-old woman before the foundation could be examined. May Calloway had written in the margin, "What does this mean? Am I wrong?" She had not been wrong. She had been right about everything, and she had held this document in her hands without knowing what it was, and she had been pushed out of her home 14 months later, and she had died 2 years after that without ever knowing. Rebecca sat on the kitchen floor with the paper in her hands and didn't move for a long time. The house was very quiet. The radiators made small settling noises in the walls. Outside, the November rain moved through the bare maple trees. She was not a person who cried easily. In 16 years of this work she had heard many stories of injustice sustained and redress denied, and she had learned to absorb them and redirect them rather than carry them, because carrying them in the wrong way made you ineffective. She cried now, briefly, alone on the kitchen floor, for the woman who had carved a letter into a porch column and who had held the key to her own vindication in her hands without knowing what to do with it. Then she got up, put the document in a plastic archival sleeve, labeled it, and added it to her accordion folder. She went back downstairs and retrieved the rest of the papers from May's box and brought them upstairs and went through each one carefully, because that was how you honored someone who'd been wronged. You took everything seriously, you left nothing unread, you built the complete picture. In late November she circulated a petition through the community. She printed it on plain paper, hand-delivered it to every address in the subdivision over 2 days, and wrote the cover letter herself, in plain language that was not designed to alarm but to inform. The petition requested 2 things. First, that a special meeting be called to discuss material questions regarding the validity of certain provisions of the CC&Rs as amended in 2014, and second, that the board authorize an independent forensic audit of HOA finances. Both requests were explicitly authorized under state law, the first requiring a 10% signature threshold and the second requiring 20%. She included the statutory citations. She needed 22 signatures for the audit request. She had 47 within 4 days. The response from the board came via Gerald Fitch, who wrote a letter asserting that the petition was procedurally defective on grounds he did not specify clearly, which meant the grounds were either manufactured or unsupportable. The letter also contained a thinly veiled threat about disruption of community governance and a reference to the board's full range of legal remedies. She filed the letter in the section of her accordion folder labeled Obstruction, Documentary Record, and confirmed the meeting date with the board secretary, who was required by state law to schedule the meeting within 45 days of receiving a valid petition. The second response came in person. She was walking back from her car one Tuesday evening in early December when she found Vivian standing on the sidewalk in front of number 14, not passing by, not engaged in any particular activity, simply standing with her clipboard and looking at the property with the focused inventory expression she used when building a violation case. It was the most honest thing Rebecca had seen Vivian do, an expression undiluted by social performance, simply calculating. "Good evening," Rebecca said. Vivian looked at her. The professional smile was there, but it was operating on reduced power, and underneath it, for the first time, Rebecca could see something else, not malice exactly, but the cold pragmatism of someone who has spent a long time in control and is running the scenarios of what happens if that changes. "I think we should have a frank conversation," Vivian said. "I'm happy to have one. What you're doing is destructive. You've been here 6 weeks. You've circulated a petition that has caused significant anxiety among residents, you've sent legal correspondence that has cost this board money to respond to, and you've been asking questions that are clearly intended to damage this community's governance rather than improve it." She paused. "I've built something here. 17 years of work. Property values that have increased 38%. A neighborhood that people are proud to live in. And you're trying to tear it down." "I'm not trying to tear anything down, Vivian." Rebecca kept her voice even. "I'm asking questions that the law allows me to ask. I'm requesting records that the law requires you to provide. And I'm raising a procedural question about the 2014 amendment that, if the math is what I believe it is, means that Section 47 was never validly adopted." She paused. "If your governance has been sound, an independent audit will confirm that. Why would you oppose confirming something you believe to be true?" The silence between them had a different texture than Vivian's silences usually did. It was not the controlled pause of someone managing a negotiation. It was the involuntary silence of someone who knows they don't have an answer to the question that was just asked. "You think you're very smart," Vivian said, and for the first time there was something unguarded in her voice, not anger exactly, but something closer to genuine feeling, which was both more human and more unsettling than the performance. "I think I've done my homework," Rebecca said quietly. "Good night, Vivian." She walked inside. She stood in her entryway in the dark for a moment, then went to the kitchen and sat down with a glass of water, and thought about what she had seen in Vivian Hartwell's face. She had seen it before, in other cases, at the moment when the person who had been running a system begins to understand that the system is running out of room. It was not a pleasant thing to see. Vivian was not, she thought, a person without conscience. She was a person in whom the conscience had been so thoroughly overridden by the logic of control and accumulated justification that it only surfaced in unguarded moments. That made her neither innocent nor deserving of sympathy, but it made her more comprehensible. She added a note to her file, to herself: "Be accurate. Don't be cruel." The special meeting was held on the second Wednesday of December. The community clubhouse had never been so full. 104 of the 112 households sent at least one representative. People stood along the walls and sat on the floor along the sides, and the folding chair arrangement became irrelevant within the first 10 minutes as people shifted and clustered and the room took on the charged, attentive atmosphere of a community that had finally decided to pay attention. Eleanor Marsh sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfectly straight, wearing the same ivy-colored cardigan. Raj Patel sat in the third row with his wife Priya, who had taken a half day from work to be there and who had the expression of someone who has been listening to a particular story for a long time and has finally arrived at the chapter where something happens. Marcus Davenport sat at the board table, separated from the other four members by an empty chair he had shifted deliberately back, a physical statement. Lorraine Vega sat near the back with a leather portfolio on her lap and the preoccupied eyes of someone running numbers in her head. Gordon Park, a retired municipal attorney from number 47 who had been watching the proceedings with professional interest, sat near the aisle with a legal pad. Rebecca sat 4 rows back, center, with a manila folder and her laptop. She wore the dark blazer. Vivian opened the meeting with a prepared statement. Her voice was controlled, her posture was excellent, and she read from a printed document with the steady delivery of someone who has decided that performance is the last line of defense. She asserted that the board had reviewed the petition's concerns with outside counsel, that the CC&Rs were valid and had been properly adopted, that the HOA's finances were fully compliant with all applicable law, and that the board was committed to transparency and welcomed constructive engagement. Then she opened the floor. Rebecca raised her hand. She stood and spoke for 12 minutes. She had not rehearsed what she would say in the conventional sense, she had not written it out, had not practiced it in front of a mirror. She had, instead, spent 3 months building the foundation under it, so that when she stood up to say it, the words had the weight of everything behind them. She explained what a supermajority requirement was and why it existed in HOA governance, not as a technicality, but as a fundamental democratic protection, ensuring that no board could unilaterally alter the rules under which all residents lived without genuine community consensus. She showed the math on her laptop screen, projected through a portable mini projector she had set up on a chair to the side of the room. 76 reported votes. 112 eligible owners, 3 invalid votes, and why they were invalid, shown with specific documentary references, the county assessor records for 2014, the subdivision plat. 73 valid votes. 65.17%. Below the 67% threshold by a margin that did not admit of debate. Section 47 did not achieve the required supermajority, she said. Under settled state law, an amendment that fails to meet this threshold is void from its inception, void ab initio, meaning it has no legal effect and never did. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of arithmetic. She paused. Every enforcement action taken under Section 47, every fine, every lien placement, every contract executed without competitive bidding under its authority, was taken without legal foundation. The people in this community who were fined, liened, and in 7 cases forced to sell their homes, were subjected to enforcement actions that the board had no legal authority to take. The room was very quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. She then presented the second part of what she had to say, and she presented it carefully, because this part required precision more than any other. I am also presenting data tonight that I have provided to the State Attorney General's office and to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She advanced to a second slide on her screen, a map of the subdivision, with the 7 displaced households marked. These are the 7 households whose lien-related property transfers I have documented. I have also analyzed the demographic data of all ownership transfers in Cedarwood Estates since 2014. Of the 7 households displaced through the lien process, 6 were headed by non-white homeowners or by elderly white homeowners without family support. The enforcement rate among households with non-white owners is 6 times the enforcement rate among comparable households with white owners. She let the numbers sit there on the screen. One of those 7 households was my grandmother's. May Calloway lived at this address, at the house I now own, for 19 years. She received 47 violation notices in 3 years, more than any other single resident in this community's recorded history. She was 81 years old when the board placed a lien on her property. She sold under duress and died 2 years later without returning to her home. Her voice remained even throughout this. She had decided, weeks ago, that she was not going to allow it to break, because the facts were powerful enough on their own and she was not here to perform grief. I am not making accusations tonight. I am presenting documented facts. What you do with them is your decision as a community. She sat down. Gordon Park, the retired municipal attorney, raised his hand immediately. I move that this meeting vote to retain independent legal counsel to assess the validity of the CC&Rs and to commission a full forensic audit of association finances conducted by an outside firm with no prior relationship to this board. Second, said Marcus, from the board table. Vivian made a visible effort to regain control of the room. I'd like to note that the board has already consulted with counsel, and that the characterizations made tonight are one-sided and. The motion is on the floor, Gordon said pleasantly. We should vote. The vote was 91 in favor, 7 against. Vivian voted no and remained at the table, very still, for a moment after the count was announced. Then she gathered her portfolio and her clipboard and walked out of the room, and nobody moved to stop her or call after her, and the door swung closed behind her, and the meeting continued without her. In the weeks that followed, The structure that had held for 11 years came apart with the particular speed of things that have been overdue for coming apart. Gerald Fitch resigned as HOA attorney within the week, citing an undisclosed conflict of interest, language that meant he had looked at the documents and decided he would prefer not to be in the room when they were examined more carefully. Douglas Hartwell resigned as treasurer the same day. Philip Crane submitted his resignation by email the following Monday, without explanation. Sandra Fitch resigned 2 days after that. Vivian submitted her resignation on a Friday afternoon in December, by email, with no accompanying statement. The subject line read, "Resignation from Cedarwood Estates HOA Board of Directors." The body of the email contained 2 sentences. Rebecca learned about it from Eleanor, who called to tell her at 6:30 on a Friday evening, and who sounded, for the first time since Rebecca had known her, genuinely at rest. An emergency board meeting was called for the following Tuesday. Marcus attended and submitted his own resignation, which he had apparently prepared carefully and which included a statement acknowledging his awareness of financial irregularities and his failure to pursue them adequately, and his cooperation going forward with any investigation. 5 new interim board members were elected from the floor: Eleanor Marsh, Raj Patel, Gordon Park, a woman named Cassandra Lee who was a CPA and who had been attending meetings for 2 years without saying much, and a retired teacher named Henry Drummond who lived at number 33 and had been writing formal letters of complaint about the board for 4 years without anyone paying attention to them. The forensic audit was completed in 8 weeks. The independent firm retained by the new board documented, with the quiet precision of accountants who take no pleasure in their findings but take accuracy seriously, approximately $287,000 in payments to Hartwell Home Services LLC that were either unsupported by adequate documentation, executed without competitive bidding as required under state nonprofit law, or that exceeded comparable market rates by margins ranging from 41 to 117%. The audit also identified a secondary account that had been opened in 2018, authorized by signatures from Vivian and Douglas Hartwell, through which approximately $63,000 had been transferred over 4 years to entities that the auditors could not connect to any documented HOA expenditure. The audit report was filed with the county and provided to the State Attorney General's office, which had already opened a civil investigation based on Rebecca's earlier submission. The investigation moved with the measured speed of state regulatory enforcement, not fast, but inexorably forward. Tamara Osei called Rebecca on a Thursday morning in February. The Cedar Group Trust, Tamara said. We've confirmed it connects to structures in 4 other counties. 3 other HOAs, same playbook, systematic fine escalation targeting specific demographic groups, lien placement, forced sale to affiliated entities, resale at premium. We've been building the case for 2 years. What you documented in Cedarwood Estates is the clearest ground-level evidence of the local operation we've been able to establish. How does it resolve? Federal Fair Housing Act charges against at least 4 individuals. Civil and potentially criminal, depending on what the financial forensics show at the next level up. This is going to take another year to fully develop, but it's going. A pause. You did good work, Beck. My grandmother did the work, Rebecca said. She just didn't know what she had. The state civil complaint against Vivian and Douglas Hartwell was filed in March. The complaint alleged breach of fiduciary duty to the HOA, fraudulent misappropriation of association funds, and violations of the state nonprofit board governance statute. It sought disgorgement of all improperly obtained funds, civil penalties, and a bar on both from serving in any HOA governance capacity in the state. The liens placed on the 7 displaced properties were voided by court order, retroactively, on the grounds that they had been placed under the authority of a provision that was void from inception. Rebecca filed a civil recovery claim on behalf of May Calloway's estate against Cedarwood Property Solutions LLC, seeking compensatory and punitive damages for the forced sale. The claim was based on the fraudulent misrepresentation of the lien's legal validity, the pattern of discriminatory enforcement, and the waived attorney-client communication showing that the board had known the legal foundation was questionable and had proceeded anyway. Raj Patel received a full refund of his $4,200 fine, with interest, by certified check, with a cover letter from the new board that included a formal apology. He read the apology twice and then put it in a frame and hung it in his home office, not because he thought it was funny but because he decided he wanted to remember that accountability was possible. 6 other residents received similar refunds. The total amount refunded in the first 4 months of the new board's tenure was $61,400. Lorraine Vega was retained by the new board as their primary bookkeeper, with full access to all accounts and a written agreement specifying that she reported to the board as a whole rather than to any individual officer. Marcus Davenport sold his house in February and moved to Alexandria with his wife and their son. He and his wife were, Rebecca gathered from Eleanor, navigating something difficult but navigating it together. She thought about him sometimes, about the long uncomfortable middle space between knowing something is wrong and doing something about it, about how much easier it was to stay in that space than to move, and about the cost of staying there too long. He had moved in the end. That counted for something. Diane Whitfield, the neighbor who had told Rebecca that there was a certain type of person who came into a community and tried to change everything, knocked on her door in January. She stood on the porch with her hands in her jacket pockets and an expression that had cost her something. "I wanted to say I was wrong," she said. "About what I said in the fall. About you not understanding the community." A pause. "I understood the community wrong. I thought the rising property values meant things were good. I didn't look at how the values were rising or who was paying the cost." She met Rebecca's eyes. "I'm sorry about your grandmother." "Thank you," Rebecca said. "I appreciate you saying that. I also want to know, is there anything I can do? Going forward. To make sure this doesn't happen again." "Show up to the meetings," Rebecca said. "Read the financial summaries. Ask questions when the numbers don't make sense. That's most of it. Systems like this one don't survive scrutiny, they survive because people assume someone else is doing the scrutinizing." In April, Rebecca taught a pro bono workshop at the Fairfax County Public Library, organized through the Housing Equity Legal Center's Regional Outreach Program. She had proposed it herself, because the thing that had most stayed with her since the fall, more than the legal victories, more than the satisfaction of watching a carefully built case do what a carefully built case was supposed to do, was her grandmother's handwritten question in the margin of that document. "What does this mean? Am I wrong?" She had not been wrong. She had simply not known the words for what she knew. 12 people came to the workshop. They were renters and homeowners and people in HOA disputes and people who had received letters they didn't understand and people who suspected they were being treated unfairly and weren't sure how to find out. There was a nursing home aide who had received a lien threat she didn't understand. There was a retired postal worker whose condo association had been assessing fees he'd never seen authorized in any meeting. There was a young couple, both teachers, who had bought their first house 6 months ago and who had already received 2 violation notices that didn't seem right to them but who hadn't known what to do with that feeling. Rebecca stood at the front of the room with printed handouts, a plain language guide to HOA governing documents, a checklist of property owners' rights under state law, a step-by-step guide to requesting public records, a list of free and low-cost legal resources, and she said, before anything else, the thing she most wanted to say. "I want to start with something that sounds simple but that I've found, in 16 years of this work, is genuinely hard for most people to believe until they've seen it for themselves. The documents matter. Whatever situation you're in, whatever someone is telling you that you have to accept, whatever fine you've been told you have to pay, whatever rule you've been told you have to follow, the documents matter. Rules that were not properly adopted are not valid rules. Fines that exceed the board's legal authority are not enforceable fines. Rights that aren't exercised don't disappear. They wait." She paused. The room was attentive in the particular way of people who are listening for something they need. The people who misuse these systems are almost always counting on one thing, that you don't know what the documents say. They're counting on the intimidating thickness of the CC&Rs, the legal language, the formal letterhead, the suggestion that challenging them is somehow inappropriate or risky. Most of the time, when you look carefully at the documents, you find that the authority they're claiming is either much more limited than they suggest, or improperly established, or both. The nursing home aide, her name was Patricia, she said, when she introduced herself, raised her hand. "What if you can't afford a lawyer?" "That's exactly why workshops like this one exist," Rebecca said, "and there are more resources than most people know: legal aid clinics, nonprofit advocacy organizations, law school housing clinics, state attorney general complaint processes, federal housing agencies. I'm going to give you all of those before you leave tonight." She paused. "But I want to say something more important: you don't always need a lawyer to know your rights. You need to be willing to read, to ask for documents, and to put things in writing. A certified letter that says I am requesting the meeting minutes in which this rule was adopted costs you under $1 and can completely change the dynamics of a situation. Asking for documentation is not aggressive. It is your legal right. And the act of asking, just asking, in writing, often reveals whether the other side has a real position or just an intimidating posture." The young husband, his name was David, leaned forward. "What if they just don't care? What if they know they're wrong and they keep pushing anyway? Then you document everything and you find the institution with authority over them. A state attorney general. A county oversight office. A federal housing agency. A court." She met his eyes. "Those institutions are imperfect and they are slow. I won't tell you otherwise. But they exist, and they have real authority, and the people misusing these systems are usually counting on 2 things being true: that you don't know the rules, and that you're too exhausted or too intimidated to find out. Both of those assumptions can be wrong. You decide whether they're wrong. She stayed 40 minutes after the session ended, answering individual questions, going through specific documents people had brought, pointing them to the right resources. Patricia had brought a stack of notices and a letter from an attorney that was designed to be frightening and that, when Rebecca read it carefully, turned out to assert no specific legal claim at all, just language arranged to look like a threat. She showed Patricia exactly where the claim should have been and wasn't, and watched the expression on the woman's face shift from fear to a focused, clarifying anger. So they were bluffing, Patricia said. They were using language designed to prevent you from looking closely enough to notice it was a bluff, Rebecca said. That's most of what this kind of intimidation is. It depends on the gap between what you know and what they know, or what they want you to think they know. So the answer is just, close the gap. Close the gap, Rebecca agreed. One document at a time. She drove home through the April dark with the windows cracked, the air cool and carrying the early smell of growing things, the trees along the highway beginning to show their first real green. She pulled into the driveway of 14 Cedarwood Lane and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house. The porch light was on. She always left it on. The street was quiet, the neighbors' houses lit warmly behind their windows, the maples on the block showing the soft haze of new leaves that always looked, at this stage, like the trees were still making up their minds. Somewhere down the block, she could hear a child's bicycle, the particular metallic rattle of a bike that needed its chain adjusted, and a parent's voice, and laughter. She went to the porch and crouched down at the base of the right column and put her fingers against the small carved C and held them there. She thought about her grandmother doing this, not crouching to look at the letter, but standing on this porch on an ordinary morning, painting the columns white in the spring. Living a life of the ordinary deep kind, cooking in this kitchen, watching television in that living room, tending the garden in the back that had been paved over at some point, knowing her neighbors by name, accumulating a life here the way people do when they're allowed to stay. She thought about what it cost to be pushed out of a life like that. Not just the money, the $9,200 in fraudulent fines, the below-market sale price, the profit Cedarwood Property Solutions had extracted. The other costs. The cost of displacement itself, of being made to leave the place where your continuity lived, where your identity had accumulated over years, where you were simply and completely yourself. May Calloway had spent the last 2 years of her life in a perfectly adequate apartment 2 towns over, and she had never stopped being a woman who had been made to leave her home. That was the real theft, and it was the one no settlement could fully address. But it could be documented. It could be named. It could be prevented from happening again to someone else, to the next May Calloway or the next elderly widower or the next young engineer who moved into a neighborhood and found, to his bewilderment, that the place he had chosen to build his life had decided, through the application of a clipboard and a spectrophotometer and the accumulated weight of fraudulent authority, that he was not quite welcome in it. The systems of law existed for this, not to make justice automatic, not to make it fast, not even to make it certain, but to make it possible. To give the May Calloways of the world a language and a set of tools and a path, however slow and difficult, toward accountability. And the systems only worked when people knew they existed and knew how to use them, and that knowledge was not evenly distributed, and the unevenness of that distribution was itself a form of injustice. She had learned this as a lawyer, and she had felt it as a granddaughter, and she had come to believe that the most useful thing she could do with 16 years of practice was not to fight the battles herself but to give people the map, to stand in a room in a public library and say, here is how this works, here is what you're entitled to, here is what the documents say, here is how you close the gap. Her grandmother had held the evidence of her own vindication in her hands and written in the margin, what does this mean? Am I wrong? She had not been wrong. She had simply needed someone to give her the words. The civil suit on behalf of May Calloway's estate settled 14 months after Rebecca filed it. The settlement amount was $287,000, paid by the successor entities to Cedarwood Property Solutions LLC. Rebecca placed the funds in a charitable trust, established in May Calloway's name, designated for fair housing legal assistance grants to homeowners who could not otherwise afford representation in HOA disputes. She established the trust through the Housing Equity Legal Center, with a board that included Eleanor Marsh, Gordon Park, and 2 other community members. The first grants were awarded 8 months later to 6 households in 3 states. The state civil complaint against Vivian and Douglas Hartwell settled 15 months after filing for $412,000, including full disgorgement of improperly obtained funds and a permanent bar on both from serving in any HOA governance capacity in the state of Virginia. Vivian Hartwell declined comment when the local paper ran a brief story about the settlement. She had sold her house in Cedarwood Estates in the fall, and Rebecca did not know where she had gone, and did not particularly need to. The federal fair housing investigation continued into the following year. 4 individuals were eventually charged under the Fair Housing Act in connection with the broader displacement operation that the Cedar Group Trust had been part of. The case established useful precedent on the use of systematic fine escalation as a mechanism for discriminatory displacement, a form of conduct that had been occurring for decades in HOA communities across the country, quietly, under the cover of community standards enforcement, targeted at people who didn't know the documents well enough to fight back. The C carved into the porch column at 14 Cedarwood Lane was noted in the property's maintenance records at Eleanor's request, in a brief entry that read, "Original architectural detail, base of right front column. Historic feature, to be preserved in all future maintenance." On a Saturday morning in May, Rebecca was on her front porch with coffee when Eleanor came by on her morning walk and stopped at the gate. The maples were fully leafed out now, deep and green, moving in a slow warm wind. The street had the easy, inhabited quality of a neighborhood in which people felt, more or less, at ease. "I have a question for you," Eleanor said, leaning on the gate. "Are you going to stay? Here, in this house?" Rebecca thought about it. She looked at the street, at the maples, at the familiar line of houses that had looked, on the October morning she arrived, like something assembled to a template. They still looked maintained, still looked cared for. But they looked different now, more various, somehow. Number 23 had a new garden along the front walk that Raj's wife Priya had planted, which did not match the standard mum rotation and was instead a cheerful and particular mix of plants that clearly reflected someone's personal aesthetic. Number 9, Eleanor's house, had a new set of wind chimes on the porch that made a soft sound in the May wind. At number 41, a family with 2 young children had moved in 2 months ago, and there were chalk drawings on the driveway that had been there for a week without anyone issuing a notice. "For a while," she said. "Long enough to make sure things are working the way they should. And then? Then there are other places that need what this place needed." She paused. "There are a lot of communities where nobody's pulled the documents yet." Eleanor looked at her with the composed, watchful expression that was her natural face, the expression of a woman who had seen a lot and kept careful record of it and was still, at 70, paying close attention. "Your grandmother would be glad you came back," she said simply. Rebecca put her hand around her coffee cup and looked at the column, at the porch, at the house that had come back to her family through the operation of documents and the slow persistent pressure of documented truth. "I know," she said. She finished her coffee on the porch in the May morning, and the wind moved through the maples, and somewhere down the street a child's bicycle rattled past, and the wind chimes at number 9 rang softly, and the street held its quiet ordinary life, which was the only kind of life that mattered and the kind most worth protecting. Then she went inside and opened her laptop and got back to work. There were other documents. There were always other documents. And in some other subdivision, in some other county, in some other state, someone with a clipboard was walking towards someone's front door, counting on the fact that the person inside didn't know what they were entitled to, didn't know what the document said, didn't know that the rules cut both ways. Rebecca Calloway knew. And she had learned, in Cedarwood Estates and from her grandmother's handwriting in the margin of a misfiled letter, that knowledge was not a personal possession. It was a tool. And the most important thing you could do with a tool was put it in the hands of the people who needed it most. The May Callaway Fair Housing Assistance Fund awarded its first 12 grants in the spring of the following year, to homeowners in 6 states facing fraudulent HOA enforcement actions. 7 of the 12 cases were resolved in the homeowner's favor within 18 months, 4 of the remaining 5 produced settlements. 1 was still in litigation. Every grant letter included, at Rebecca Calloway's insistence, a plain language explanation of the homeowner's legal rights and a checklist for requesting governing documents. "The goal," she wrote in the fund's founding charter, "is not to fight every battle on behalf of people who need help. The goal is to give people the knowledge to fight their own battles, and to be there beside them when the fight is too big to fight alone." The carved C at the base of the right column of 14 Cedarwood Lane's front porch remained, and was preserved, and was there for anyone who knew to look for it.